Hello, good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's session as a part of the Sustainable and Inclusive Solutions for Air Quality and Climate Change event. My name is Patrick Baker and I'm the Communications and Marketing Manager at Clean Air Asia, and I'll be your host for today's session, which concerns building political support with stakeholder engagement and strategic communications. Before we commence with today's session, I just want to quickly go over some of the usual event reminders. You can review completed sessions by clicking the Watch Replay under the Schedule tab. You can join topic and sector-specific discussions on air quality and climate change in the Lounge section of AirMeet. Don't forget to pledge for sustainable and inclusive actions for air quality and climate change, and you can access the digital board for commitment from reception or through the link that will be provided in the chat box. Let your voices be heard and participate in polls that are running throughout the whole event. And also remember that booths are available where you can learn more about organisers and partners and their knowledge products and access visual summaries and also chat with exhibitors as well. And also don't forget to share the event on social media and continue discussion there as well outside of the event and between the sessions. Make sure you use the hashtag #AllForCleanAir to make sure that we're all included on a part of the discussion. Just to quickly remind you that the whole event is being recorded, both video and the chat. And also participants are requested to send questions and comments via the Q&A and the chat box. And facilitators and resource speakers will respond via the chat or live if time permits. Remember that there is an interpretation function available by clicking on the headset logo on the lower right-hand side of the screen, and you select the relevant language. But please remember to mute the original audio to hear the translation clearly. And if you're experiencing slow internet, you can change from the high definition button and change to LD, and that should improve your connection speed. So let's get started. So even though technically sound and cost-effective solutions to air pollution have been developed, unfortunately at times politicians can lack the motivation necessary to adopt these solutions. And this could be for a variety of often very understandable reasons, such as lack of data, lack of information, budgetary constraints, or competing priorities. Today we're going to be exploring how to effectively guide and harness the public's perception of air pollution and climate change in order to influence policy, and ultimately that's to improve air quality and to save lives. This session is going to be focused around what promises to be enlightening and informative conversations with a great mix of political leaders, NGO representatives, media and communication specialists lined up for you today. In the conversations, we aim to showcase some great good practice examples of civil society and media campaigns that advocate for stronger policies around air quality and climate governance. We'll be discussing with political leaders themselves about what motivates them to strengthen air pollution related policies, as well as touching on some of the mechanisms available to make the case for stronger air pollution and climate change policies more persuasive. So before I hand over to my colleagues to get the discussion going, I just wanted to take a few moments to briefly set the scene by talking about the essential components of an effective communication strategy, as well as touching on some of the definitions of what we actually mean by advocacy. So air quality communication must now compete with a growing amount of information online, and much of that can be quite dubious quality. And this is why it's so important to have a solid communication strategy in place. So in this context, what do I mean by communication strategy? Well, at the most fundamental level, it's about answering these questions. Who is your target audience? What is the message to be communicated? Where will you reach them? As in, which channel is the most effective? And why are you doing this communication? What is the desired impact? And really, it's this impact section that we're focusing on today. So in this context, what do we mean when I talk about impact? Well, a robust communication strategy will usually seek to either inform, change attitudes, or influence behaviour, or actually any combination of these at all. So to inform the public is about raising awareness of the effects of pollution on the health of communities, and a better informed citizenry can ultimately be a key ally in influencing policy. But it's important to remember that enhancing knowledge alone may not necessarily change attitude or behaviour. These don't necessarily lead from one to the other. A communication strategy can seek to change attitudes. How do target audiences feel about measures? Can their concerns be alleviated? And it's important to remember that changing attitudes is achieved by an engagement with the audience, which is a two-way communication. This isn't just about broadcasting data, broadcasting information. It's about entering into a dialogue with communities that you are concerned with. And ultimately, influencing behaviour is the most powerful outcome and impact of a communication strategy. Of some projects, this could mean changing individuals' behaviour. So, for example, encouraging cycling rather than driving. But it can also mean encouraging communities to take actions to help influence policy that will ultimately improve their lives, because either way, behaviour change is aimed at improving air quality. And I just want to kind of reinforce all along this that communication's a two-way conversation. It's not just a broadcast, it's a dialogue. So as today's session focuses primarily on communication in the service of advocacy, I thought it would be a good idea to touch on a definition of advocacy here. So the voluntary service overseas, which is an international volunteer development NGO, they provide this definition, which I think is a really helpful start to understanding what we mean by advocacy. And it speaks of the disadvantaged demographics, which I thought made it particularly relevant to this event. And they define advocacy as a process that tackles disadvantage by working with communities and key stakeholders to bring about changes in policy, process, practice, and attitudes in order to ensure that communities' rights are recognised and realised. The aim is to actively support disadvantaged people to influence decisions that affect their rights and their lives. So advocacy can be understood as two primary pillars, campaigning and lobbying. If I'm being honest, there are more elements than this, including building networks as well as data gathering and research. But I think these are the two core concepts that it's important to understand first and that will most closely align with our session today. There was a great session yesterday on citizen science and low-cost nudges, which addressed some of those other elements. So if you were in that session yesterday, all of that ties together with what we're talking about here. So campaigning and lobbying are two tools which are often confused or mixed up, but it is important to remember them as distinct but ultimately complementary entities. Essentially, campaigning is about giving disadvantaged populations the tools that they need themselves to influence change to improve their own lives. It's designed to honestly demonstrate that the public, voters, and consumers alike are concerned about an issue. And this can take many forms. I've just put a couple of examples here, pledges, petitions, letter writing, speaking to peers, disseminating information in the form of fact sheets, FAQs and leaflets. And to be honest, the tools that can be created for campaigning are limited only really by your imagination and your budget. It's a bottom-up approach that ultimately should be positive, empowering and motivating for communities that are often the most affected by issues such as air pollution and climate change. In contrast, lobbying is a much more personalised approach focused around building relationships with stakeholders and decision makers, and often features face-to-face meetings, negotiations, and building presentations using the most reliable and recent data available. Both of these, I think particularly lobbying, can have a bad name in the public perception, but lobbying isn't necessarily negative. What it essentially is about finding common ground between citizens and decision makers for the benefit of the entire community. But I do feel like it's important to address the fact that in this event and this session, we have a wide geographical spread of attendees right across the region, and there is no one-size-fits-all advocacy template that works in all countries, all political systems, or even individual cities and regional districts. It's vital to remember, for example, the power that language has, and to be mindful over the words that you use to ensure any communication strategy is effective and relationships with key stakeholders are maintained. So, for example, in some languages and countries, advocacy, lobbying, and campaigning, as mentioned, can have negative connotations or bring with them a degree of controversy, particularly due to campaigns that have happened in the past. But this doesn't make them any less important or less powerful. It's just important to be mindful of the language that you use. So, just as one example, influence rather than lobby can actually be better at forming those relationships. So depending on the relationship between civil society and the government or company in question, it is often important to carry out a risk analysis as a part of any advocacy strategy to ensure that your channels and develop your messaging wisely. And finally, as I come to the end of my introduction, I just want to point out the importance of evaluating. Evaluation is absolutely essential for a successful communications and advocacy strategy. And that is essentially to ensure that it's having the desired impact. And this starts right at the beginning of your strategy design, as you establish clear goals for communication and set key performance indicators that can help you define what success looks like. So that's about establishing clear goals for communications, including, are you looking to raise awareness, change attitudes and behaviors, or ultimately influence policy change? And it's also important to consider both quantitative and qualitative performance indicators. Examples of quantitative can include opportunities to see, website hits, petition signatures, social media interactions, media coverage. But for a more qualitative evaluation can be a little bit more tricky. To do that, it's vital to create dialogues with both the communities you are working with as well as decision makers. And again, never forget that communication works both ways. And events like this today, I think, are a perfect example of this, about creating dialogue and speaking with leaders, speaking with the media, and bringing people together to engage in this kind of two-way conversation. And today's session is a really great example of that. We thought, in order to promote good, positive stakeholder engagement, it would be important to hear from leaders themselves to find out more about their views on air quality, climate change, but also, most importantly, what is it that motivates them to take action? To this end, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Glinda Batambatalina, to lead a virtual fireside chat with two shining examples of leaders in the region. My colleague Glinda is a lawyer with more than 20 years experience in air quality management. She was a member of the legal team which assisted the Philippine government in drafting the Clean Air Act of 1999, implementing rules and regulations. She led the implementation of the Asia Clean Fuels and Vehicles Programme, which resulted in national policies and roadmaps for cleaner fuels and vehicles in the Vietnam, Philippines, and Pakistan. Glinda, the floor is yours. I'd like to hand over to you now.
Hello, Patrick. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thank you all for joining us in this very interesting session. And having worked
Apologies, I'm not sure what happened there. I think, Glinda, both ourselves, we've been muted and cameras turned on.
Okay. Uh, Sorry about that. So I don't know where until where you caught my welcome. I was just saying that in my experience of 20 years, it is really important to be able to engage different stakeholders, especially in a very complex environmental issue as air pollution. And I was citing the example of moving countries like Vietnam and the Philippines towards stricter vehicle emission standards from Euro 2 to Euro 4, for example. And this was in 2009, where we needed to engage the different stakeholders, government, having to speak and discuss with private sector from the motor vehicle manufacturers and the oil refineries. And of course, we have the very active civil society groups as well as academia. And These discussions and these multi-stakeholder um, engagements are really key to get policies, very critical policies, passed. And so, this issue of communication is really important. And that's why we're having this chat with our champions from these two countries in Southeast Asia. So I am very privileged to introduce to you Honorable Dia Roro Esti Widya Putri and Engineer Noel Hechanova, who we will have a fireside chat with today. Honorable Dia is a member of parliament in Indonesia, representing the district of Gresik and Lamongan, East Java. She sits in this important commission which deals extensively with the energy, research, innovation, and industry sectors. She is also Secretary of the Green Economy Caucus at the Indonesian Parliament. She graduated from Imperial College London under the Indonesian Ministry of Finance Scholarship and is co founder of the Indonesian Energy and Environmental Institute. Welcome, Honorable Dia. It is also my pleasure to introduce Engineer Noel Hechanova, the head of the City Environment and Natural Resources Office of Iloilo City in the Philippines. Engineer Hechanova has worked tirelessly for more than 10 years to improve the air in Iloilo City, an educational and economic center in the central region of the Philippines. Among his achievements include the successful shift of thousands of households from cooking with biomass to affordable liquefied petroleum gas or LPG kits, the reduction of emissions from polluting diesel run jeepneys in his city, and increasing awareness and engagement of all sectors of society in the air pollution issue. As a start to our discussion, it would be great if you would each talk a little about how you view the issues of air pollution and climate change and its relationship with the Sustainable Development Goals and achieving these for your constituencies. May I start with you, Honorable Dia?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you so much, Glinda, and thank you. I'd like to expand my thank you to Clean Air Asia for having me here today. I'm currently in the US and it's actually 12 a.m. right here. But either way, I'm glad to be able to join and to have this discussion with all of you. I think when we speak of climate change, we are also speaking about something that is not only currently happening, but it has been happening for quite some time now. And we are starting to really just feel the negative impacts that comes along with it. And so, in relation to the discussions that has taken place a few weeks ago at COP, I was there as well during the COP 26 in Glasgow, in the UK, and there are immense discussions with regards to how each country who have ratified the Paris Agreement can achieve their nationally determined contributions. Indonesia as a country, we've set a target of achieving a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 29% and also 41% with international aid. And, being a part of these discussions, I'm starting to see a trend that is currently happening. The good news is that sustainable practices is being put at the forefront when we speak of growth. And this is happening in multiple countries, whether it be countries in Asia, countries like Indonesia, for example, to even countries in Europe and as well as America and so forth. And so I am starting to see that there is a shift in terms of how we discuss on how to progress as a nation, how we can achieve economic growth and growth in general, and how now sustainability is being put at the forefront of development. When we speak of climate change, I think it's really important as well to not see this as a global problem or a problem that is not personal. I think one of the challenges that we have is really in increasing the understanding of not only ourselves but society at large, that this is actually a very personal problem. Why is it personal? Because the impacts is quite immense, particularly to in our towards our health and well-being. I think there are certain health factors that we feel on a daily basis, in which may be a cause of climate change, but we don't regard it as an effect of climate change. And so changing the narrative of how the negative consequences of climate change can impact your health, whether it be the quality of our air impacting our ability to breathe, for example, and the types of the diseases that comes with it, is also very important. So changing that narrative, so the impacts of climate change becomes quite a personal one, and not something that is far off from what we are currently experiencing. Another thing is also, when we speak of climate change, now is the time to really reflect on what we can do about it. This is not a problem in which we will face in the future, but it is a problem that we are facing today, right now, in which we are seeing the negative impacts and effects happening around us. And I think, especially now with the COVID-19 pandemic, how that's really shifted the way that we live our lives. I feel like this should be a momentum in itself for us to change and reset the way that we live our lives, holistically, and what kind of changes can be implemented in the way that we live our lives, in order for us to mitigate climate change, and to really just be aware of the role that we have in creating some sort of change. And one of the problems I can share, yeah, with my constituents in Gresik and Lamongan, whether it be there in my constituency or just across Indonesia in general, I think one of the things that maybe a lot of countries have in common is that not a lot of people understand what climate change is, and what kind of steps needs to be taken in order for us to prevent it from happening. And so I think this level of communication, socialization about the issue, again, turning it into a more of a personal problem, is quite vital and is quite important. Just a small example, for example, because right now we're trying to push energy transition in Indonesia as a means of decreasing greenhouse gas emissions, noting that 30% of our overall emissions come from the energy sector. And so Commission 7, which is where I am right now, which deals with the energy, research, innovation, and also industry sectors, we are very committed in the Indonesian parliament to push energy transition. We want to achieve our renewable energy target of 23%. We want to make sure that there is a law that can help make this happen, for renewables to be more competitive within the energy market, with the addition of implementing a carbon tax system, which is right now at a level of 2.5 dollars per metric ton per CO2. But the problem here is that, when I speak to the people that I represent, with in regards to the electricity in their houses, the source of electricity in their houses, whether they care about that or not, the answer is they don't. The most important thing is that the light turns on and they're able to be productive and are able to acquire income, right? And so one of the next step is to make sure that we electrify our country in a way that is also beneficial for the environment. And that is very much closely related to how we can maximize on our renewable energy potential, on technologies that can help decrease greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm starting to realize that this is more of a problem that is only well known for those who are educated and are aware of the issue. But for those living in rural areas who aren't that educated, who are not really aware of the problem, they are very short-sighted, in a sense where they don't see this global problem that is happening right now. And so how can we increase this awareness level of awareness is something that we need to also collectively do together. And again, this is not only the job of politicians, for example, in creating change through policy making, but also how can we use our level of influence to educate society and people on how they can change their day-to-day lives in order for us to prevent the negative consequences to climate change. So again, Glinda, this question is very broad, and I'm in a way giving you somewhat of a broad answer, but also a narrow answer with a response to what is happening in my constituents. And as a member of parliament, I feel like there is multiple responsibilities. There's a responsibility to communicate this to the public, there is a responsibility of creating the policies necessary, there is a responsibility to make sure that the political will is there, given the multiple agendas there are, whether it be in Indonesia or countries alike. And so making sure that politicians are also on board with energy transition. But it also helps with the fact that our president is very, very, very much concerned about tackling this problem and pushing energy transition in the country. So that makes the job a lot easier, because we do have a top-down approach, happening in response to how we should tackle this problem.
Thank you so much, Honorable Dia. Such a refreshing perspective on the need to really sharpen the communication of the problem of climate change and the solutions, and personalizing the issue such that this dichotomy of referring to climate change as a global problem while air pollution being a local problem. But as you say, in truth, it is really very personal, and that is drilling down that message and what that message could be like is a real challenge for an issue like this, which has been dominated more frequently with a lot of graphs and technical lingo. And
Mhm.
so thank you for pointing all of those very important points. Now, I'd like to shift our attention to the role that communication plays in changing this conversation at the city level. As we know, cities have been referred to as the engines of economic growth. And therefore, it is also where we feel the impacts of climate change and of air pollution. Now, I'd like to ask Engineer Noel Hechanova his thoughts on this relationship of air pollution and climate change and the sustainable development objectives that your city is aiming to achieve, and what is the importance of communicating and engaging stakeholders? Engineer Noel? Engineer Noel, I think you're still muted. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
There
Thank
you
you,
go.
Glenda. Nice to see you again, at least virtually. Iloilo City is a growing city. We are one of the highly urbanized cities in the Philippines with a population of more than 700,000. And we are the center of governance, commerce, and education in the region. And being that, we have been experiencing uh, urbanization and issues of congestions. Now, with regards to air pollution, we always like to connect this issue with health. But more than that, we would like to connect this to the growing population of cars that we are experiencing here in the city, especially that there are many affordable loans that are being offered by banks, as well as the growing population of motorcycles. When we did the emission inventory, we were more concerned about public vehicles like jeepneys. Today, we are more concerned now with cars. which are growing rapidly. And so this has contributed to traffic and congestions in the city. You know, we have narrow roads here, being an old city, and we experience um, elevated particulate matters, uh, elevated nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide emissions, and this has certainly have an impact on health. Now, with the climate change, we would like to connect these issues with typhoons and the changing weather pattern. And more than that, also, we would like to connect these to emissions of greenhouse gas, which we would like to contain. And we would like to connect this with the consumption of electricity and the use of motor vehicles. So in the past years, we have partnered with NGOs and institutions like Clean Air Asia to implement programs on air pollution and climate change. Air pollutions, we have programs particularly on motor vehicles and uh, coke stoves, green coke stoves, I mean, and on climate change, on energy efficiencies, clean fuels, and so on like that. But for many of these programs that we have been implementing, we always start with communications. We develop materials to inform the public, to engage the participation of our stakeholders, encourage them to join us. So we always start that way, informing, and then later uh, gathering them uh, uh, to join us in this program. So we have a policy on um, starting this program, for example, on involving stakeholders in preparing our communication materials. They are the ones who design these materials for effective communications. And so today, we are still at it. We are still developing many materials for, in particular, indoor indoor pollutions, uh, uh, pollution from jeepneys, etc. So, as to political agenda, very few of these issues have reached the political table. It's not a matured issue yet as far as politics is concerned. So, we have been developing also agenda to reach out to them so that they can help us enhance our campaign for air pollution and climate change.
Thank you so much, Engineer Noel. It's very, very good to see all of the efforts that the city can do in order to raise awareness about specific solutions in order to secure the buy-in from the sector that's going to be affected by your policies. Now, I want to dig a little bit deeper onto the messages. I'm sure that both of you, Honorable Dia and Engineer Noel, you are very exposed to all of the conferences, all of the media articles, and the campaigns that are, frankly, directed to you as politicians and government officials, hoping that, urging action, urging more policies. What we would like to understand, and I think many of us here, is we'd like to get into your brains um, and find out what message, what study, what image has or moved you and has kept you passionate and to continue on being a champion for the energy transition and for clean air? Maybe we start with you, Honorable Dia.
Yeah, I think the one thing that keeps me going is the fact that this is a problem where we are starting to feel the negative consequences, right? This is apparent in so many ways, and I think one of the pressing things is how can we act? How can we find the right solution going forward, and how can we put this as a focal point in which becomes a priority for all? You know, I think one of the challenges that I'm, experiencing right now, whether it be in politics or the Indonesian parliament, is in recognizing that even within the system, there needs to be some kind of a movement. We are the Parliament of Indonesia consists of nine political parties with nine different agendas, with nine different perspectives and viewpoints about what they feel development should look like for a nation. And when we speak of the energy sector, maybe some of them would focus more on the fossil fuel industry, some looking more into how we can transition as a country, some looking into how renewables can be a primal source of energy. There's a lot of different perspectives as to how they feel, how each individual political party views development, and especially within the energy sector in itself. And one of the things that I can share with everyone here today is that within Commission 7, with the nine different perspectives and political parties, we have reached a consensus that the way forward is one in which we push energy transition, and is one in which we have to make substantial changes in order for us to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions within the energy sector, and that includes how we can incorporate technologies, for example. Because the dilemma being, right, again, being in politics, in one case I'm very I should say, a visionary. I have quite a lot of hopes for change, right? I could say that. But at the same time, being in politics, um, I'm also starting to understand and see the reality of the situation. For example, Indonesia is a country that is still abundant in its resources, whether it be in renewable, but also in the fossil fuel sector. There are still a lot of reserve yet to be explored and is currently being explored. We have not reached our net emissions as of yet. It's expected to happen in 2030, and so the fossil fuel industry is still being maximized. Production is still taking place. The oil and gas industry is still running, right? But and it has contributed immensely to our economic growth. It has, created a multiplier effect in which has, the job creation of around like millions of jobs, and that has created immense multiplier effects as well to the well-being of society, and also growth in general. But at the same time, we're dealing with this climate problem, right? And so how can we transition in the smoothest way possible? And one of the ways in doing that is in ensuring that the right policies are set in place for other sectors to move in a direction in which is better for our country in the future. And that is why it's so important to integrate this whole concept of sustainability and the way that countries are run, right? Not we are not no longer only thinking about how we can prosper as a nation. Indonesia, as a primal example, we have the potential to become one of the largest economies in the world by 2045. And we are optimizing on our demographic dividend, in which 70% of our total population are of the productive age, right? And so when there are more people in the productive age, that means that our country is in a stage in which we can increase the production of goods and services, we can create immense multiplier effects, we can increase economic growth in general, right? And so that is where we are at the moment. But at the same time, when we speak of growth, we also have to think about how societies and the well-being of societies can also prosper, right? So social welfare is another factor that is very important. But what's also very important in this scenario is the environment. So how can we progress economically and socially without damaging our environment, right? And so this is this whole the notion of achieving sustainable development. We've heard of the sustainable development goals as well, right? How we can achieve this going forward is a challenge in itself. And so I think one of the things that I'm grateful for is that at least within the Indonesian parliament, the political will is there for change to occur. Now, the next homework, the next question is how can we then, with the current, for example, fossil fuel industry, being optimized and is currently taking place, how can we implement technologies that can help curb the level of CO2 emissions? That is why right now what's currently under a discussion and is quite popular is, for example, technologies like the carbon capture, utilization, storage technologies, or maybe the gasification processes when we speak of coal, right? But also, most importantly, is the best kind of transition is optimizing on these technologies, right? But at the same time, exploring our potential within the renewable energy space, because only 2.5%, I'm using Indonesia as an example, has been realized. Only 2.5% of the potential has been realized in our country. So I just hope, yeah, going forward in the future, and this is something that I'm always advocating in any event, and any situation in which, when we speak of climate change mitigation, when we speak of climate action, we have to see it more of an opportunity as opposed to a burden, right? Because the perspective is different, the motivation is also different. When we look at it as a burden, we then focus on how right now we are very comfortable in the way that we do business and the way our countries are run. So for change to occur, it's harder. It's harder for us to change something that we're quite used to and something that we're comfortable with. But when we see climate action as an opportunity for growth, right? And when we see that, oh, turns out that when we implement, sustainable practices, we can create a multiplier effect, in a sense where we can create more jobs, green jobs. We can get more people educated in this sector. We can explore industries that are better for the environment. So now the tone is different, right? When we see it as an opportunity, we have more of a drive to explore it, as opposed to feeling forced to do something that we don't want to do. So there's a whole psychological aspect behind it, and convincing other politicians and even the government to have this mindset is a homework in itself, and it's a big task. When we're always speaking about, okay, the political will has to improve, it needs to be there, and so forth, but there is a huge task that goes along with that. And this means, multiple discussions with multiple stakeholders, because it is not only the job of politicians, for example, in parliament. That's one thing. But also, how do we convince the government? How can we convince industries? How can we make sure that the sole off-taker, for example, of electricity in Indonesia, can comply to these standards of achieving a energy transition? So it's a lot of work. It really is a lot of work. But I think when we have the same mindset, the same vision, the same motivation, it makes the job a lot more easier. And I think collaboration and working together is the spirit that we all need to have in order for change to occur. Because without that, things will just continue to be the same, and conversations that take place in COP will remain as conversations, and will not lead to the change that we want and need in the future.
Thank you so much, Honorable Dia, and thank you for bringing out these two key points. One, the need for a just and equitable transition, as we transition to cleaner energy sources and look to the future, and also in the communication sphere, uh, really focusing on the positives, the air quality and the climate positives that we can gain from this transition. Now, I'd like to check with Engineer Hechanova. Um, you have been working for several decades, and thank you so much for your service, sir. What keeps you motivated, and what are the messages that keep you going on championing clean air and a safe climate in your city?
Yes, Glenda. You know, Iloilo City, like I said, is one of the smaller cities in the Philippines. So funds is an issue. So we would always prefer to do this through communications, no, stakeholders engagement. And secondly, I agree with the honorable um, Daya for that we have to balance also economic improvements and climate change issues. No, so um, for this, we find it effective to talk with uh, greenhouse gas emitters, no, like our coal-fired power plant, and talk about their greenhouse gas emissions, no, and what can we do about this. So that was, I can remember well, that was in 2008 when they started the plant, for example, and we talk about some projects that could uh, help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that project became a mangrove reforestation project, and then this evolved into a park, a beautiful park today, where the park is a venue for our education and information, no, regarding climate change. And as far as air pollution is concerned, again, we we develop materials for stakeholders to understand the impacts of air pollution in, in, the link between air pollution and health, and other things that affects the environment. So these are the two things that we do here to continue with our to sustain our projects here on air and climate change.
Thank you so much, Engineer Noel. And I also acknowledge Honorable Dia. Thank you so much, Honorable Dia, who has had to leave because it was very late where she is. Um, and I would like now to move to the next part of the program. So we have heard from the leaders themselves, and we now move to our panel discussion. Moderating this discussion, I'd like to introduce Mr. Tai Chung. Tai is the communications officer of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. He has over 10 years of experience in communications, outreach, and environmental advocacy, has worked as a journalist, filmmaker, strategic communications specialist throughout the Asia Pacific region. So I'd like to hand over to Tai the moderation for the panel discussion. Over to you, Tai.
Thank you, Glinda, and good morning from Paris, which is where I'm based at the United Nations Environment Program here. I work for the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, which has 151 partners, 73 countries, and 78 non-state partners, including other UN agencies, development banks, Clean Air Asia, and the like. And we're working on policies and working with governments to integrate policies to reduce climate emissions and air pollution as well. So nice to be here and really happy to moderate this next panel, which is an exciting panel. I'd like to introduce it. So what we're going to have a panel of two people, and then we're going to have reactors. And we're going to look at we've heard what some of the challenges are from the leaders, and particular ways that communications can help inspire action to start reducing emissions of climate greenhouse gases and air pollutants. So on the panel, I have two panelists on the panel. That's Matthew Baird, who's the director at the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, and Professor Ines Ponce de Leon from the Department of Communication at Ateneo de Manila University. And then we will, after we hear them, we will move to two reactors, who's going to be Pang Lopez, who's a project coordinator at Health Care Without Harm Asia, and Yogi Tujoliriato, who is the correspondent at CNN Indonesia. Those will be our reactors after our panelists. So Matthew and Ines, hi, good morning or good afternoon. What types of advice can strategic communication specialists offer to civil society organizations and media to amplify their messages and to change politicians' views to adopt stronger policies for air quality and climate, and particularly policies that will benefit disadvantaged segments of communities and cities? So maybe we can start with Ines, and then after Ines, you, Matthew.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Ty, and thank you very much, everyone, for having me and for making me a part of this talk. It was so gratifying and quite exciting to hear all the different conversations, the different speeches, and the different perspectives. I really want to latch on to what Patrick said much earlier. Yes, research does bear it out. Communication is all about conversation. It's not pushing information on people, but in listening to them and on listening to what they have to say and what their experiences are and how these come to bear on how we all can solve a problem that is both global and local and personal. I hope you don't mind. I'll just go real quickly through the following slides. And I really am very sorry for the noise in the background. I'm afraid I really cannot do anything about it. I do not own the wildlife. So I'm so sorry. There will be a dog for quite a while. Okay. And here we go. I am a columnist as well for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, which is a widely circulated English language newspaper here in the Philippines. And my column is entitled Question the Box. And it really is about questioning assumptions. I've loved doing this all my life. I'm both a scientist and a science communication specialist. And one of the many assumptions that we often hold about communication in general, or at least for those who have started in the business, is that media and disseminating information is the only tool we have, and that we simply need to transfer facts and information and then explain these facts clearly, because the audience, by listening, will then use information. But as I've done more and more research, I've also found that, especially in the Philippines, science communication research doesn't bear this out. And especially after the Cold War, we found that it's not about convincing, but asking each other to understand each other's perspectives. That's not to say that we can't advocate. The advocacy is still there, but there is another option: to listen to what people have to offer, to bring different stakeholders to the table, and to encourage this conversation. In the Philippines, we have a much smaller unit of governance called the barangay, or the village. And we've found that many people trust their barangay officials. They're locally elected, they're people who know the environment. And oftentimes people rely on their government, their local government, for information. They rely on broadcast media for things to talk about. So there are different channels of getting to people, but they also have different channels. They use these channels differently. And sometimes those who know science really well often don't verify what they read because they believe they know enough. So we also have that problem of misinformation. So one of the possible avenues for change, and I'm sure that Matthew will have even more avenues to talk about than I, but we found that transferring facts isn't enough. We want to encourage people to be curious about the world, not to live in their own little villages and think, oh, this is just my problem, or this is a rich person's problem, but to be curious about how the world works in both global and local ways. And this often doesn't happen with dissemination. When we think of people as people rather than socioeconomic classes, or communication as conversation rather than dissemination, we find that we can take in lots of different tools to help engage communities and help push policy forward. One research that I'd really like to do is to talk to people about the concept of trust, because this is now changing in the light of the pandemic. But what we've also found is this, that these are urgent problems, but they don't always need knee-jerk solutions. They need understanding and conversation. And I would love to hear as well about what other experiences there have been in bringing awareness, understanding, knowledge, even entertainment, and advocacy and change in different communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Inez. Matthew, I could pass it to you now.
And thank you very much, Dr. Inez. I mean, I think I do approach this from a different way. I'm an environmental lawyer. That's my background, and I'm currently the director of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, and we've run a number of webinars and events over the last years on air pollution. So one of the things, and I'm just going to share a very quick presentation, is about the idea of making the case. And it's a little bit different from a conversation, because it's certainly about explaining something, perhaps to a different audience rather than the community. Perhaps it's to policymakers and politicians. But perhaps it's also identifying that there are some good actions, and there are things that have been taken, actions to combat air pollution, not so many actions to combat climate change. But also there's a stick, and there's a consequence for decision makers to failure to take action. And I think it's, I was a little bit distressed by hearing the conversation based on the idea that Indonesia still needs to expand its fossil fuel industry. I have the same conversation in Australia. And the reality in that question is that you don't. The fossil fuel industry is the greatest single threat to the planet. Through the continuing burning and investment in fossil fuels. And now is the time when we have to have massive action to change it. It may take time, but we have to have the commitment. And one of the stories that I like to tell is the story that happened in Beijing, a population center of 3 major cities of over 15 million. We have to communicate quite effectively that air pollution is a major killer. Had it not been for COVID-19 over the last 2 years, air pollution would probably have become far more serious as a topic of conversation, even though over climate change, because the air pollution deaths and injuries are happening now. We now have the science to know how dangerous this is. And the introduction provided by Glinda at the beginning of this webinar yesterday showed how, and other speakers showed the destructive consequences that we are experiencing. Air pollution is also a wicked problem. So we acknowledge that it's a complex problem. But complexity is not the reason for failure to act. But we have to be clear. It takes time, commitment, and money. And the commitment has to be now. So any politician that says they are not committed to responding to climate change or air pollution now is a politician we should not support. These are professionals that we have to persuade them that now is the time for action. There may be a transition, but that transition is not based on continuing to do business as usual. The success story about Beijing has to be coupled with the consequences of the failure to take action, and there will be consequences, economic, reputational, and other legal consequences. Plus, of course, the consequences to our constituents and our friends and our families, and that is lung disease, that is death, that is loss of life. In terms of Beijing, very quickly, and I'm happy to present this, the slides will be available. What happened in China is that it was very complex. It was institutionally fragmented. There was a lot of lack of data, and the focus of China was on economic expansion and infrastructure delivery. Other provinces also contributed to Beijing's problems, so it needed a complex solution. It took 20 years. It took 20 years to make and enforce decisions to reduce concentrations of PM2.5 by 35% and by 25%. Did that solve the air quality problems in Beijing? No. Did that reduce the number of purple days, the number of deaths through air pollution? Certainly. Did it cost a lot of money? Undoubtedly. Over $20 or so billion. But US dollars. But what it also did is it brought together all levels of government in a systemic way, in a planning way, with monitoring, compliance, high public awareness, and this is in China, 1,000 odd monitoring stations that were all able to come together with strong laws and strong regulations from the National Congress of China that made clear, both through an action plan developed by the Beijing government and followed up by national laws to make it clear that air pollution was a problem that had to be addressed. And so what happened is this long-term commitment to improving air quality with strong legislation, with strong follow-through, with the 1,000 air monitoring stations that were public. And so everyone could see which areas of Beijing were suffering from impacts. They could be warned. So there was warnings that were given. Again, something that was denied initially, but then people realized that they had to warn their citizens and their communities if there were levels of air pollution that meant that people should stay indoors or that vulnerable people should stay indoors. And that real-time public access to air monitoring, which also led to this massive decoupling from coal-fired power stations around Beijing. It talked about removing the coal-fired boilers in Beijing, which is something perhaps more relevant to Beijing, but cities like Hanoi might also benefit from this. Clear action plans and the prosecution and financial penalties for breaching the air pollution. So it was a complex approach to a complex problem and had significant results. The other thing about the stick that I wanted to mention in terms of communicating, we can see from Indonesia, where the court has now held that the president of Indonesia had a duty of care to respond to the air pollution crisis in Jakarta. That case is still on appeal, but it shows that this is one of the type of stories we can tell and communicate, that there are consequences for failure to act, failure in reputation, but there are also damages cases where people can take litigation and sue polluters for their actions and their failure to take action. This is not something that's happening only in the Western countries or Northern countries, such as in Holland against Royal Dutch Shell. It's happening in every country, in Indonesia against peat farmers or those who are causing fires as a consequence of inappropriate peat management. It's also occurring in Thailand and the Philippines, where people are being held to account for their pollution. So this is one of those powerful stories, I think, about how we can develop and respond to some of these very, very wicked problems, not just through genteel dialogue and policy debate, but by acknowledging that this is a serious problem requiring serious issues. Air pollution does represent the clear and present danger. And as the Secretary General, in a report of Making Peace with Nature that was released earlier this year, before the declaration of the Code Red for humanity because of the climate crisis and the air pollution crisis, the Secretary General said, humanity is waging war on nature. This is senseless and suicidal. Making peace with nature, securing its health and building on the critical and underlying benefits that it provides are key to a prosperous and sustainable future for all. So part of the powerful narrative that we also have to communicate, not just to the people, but to our politicians, is that action is required now and on all fronts. This, of course, is a powerful narrative. How people respond to it is a very complex and difficult question. And that's why Dr. Inez, as a communication specialist, can hopefully ensure that these messages are carried through to the decision makers for action. Thank you very much, Salamat po, for the opportunity of talking about air pollution and climate change today.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Dr. Inez. We're now going to get a reaction from Peng and Yogi. So after hearing from the communication specialists, I would like you guys to provide feedback to these insights and share your vision on how civil society organizations and the media can further motivate politicians to advance the sort of inclusive and sustainable air quality and climate action. So let's start with Peng, and then after Peng, Yogi.
Sure. Thank you. Ty, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you very much, Dr. Inez and Matthew, both raised really interesting ways, no, of communicating what's happening out there in terms of air quality and climate change in our communities. And what's really nice about it is that it shows two ways of doing that, and that they're not mutually exclusive. So both approaches can very well be cultivated and be joined together so that we can make more powerful stories. And that's one of the things that we really want to do in the communities that we work with. We actually link them with storytellers and with legal minds so that the stories that communities have been waiting to tell. So all the communities, the frontline communities that are living nearby industries that are emitting air pollution, etc., have been wanting to tell their stories for a long time, and the problem is that they don't have the proper ears to tell those stories to, and which begs the question as to how do they tell their stories. And a lot of those stories, for example, are just shared anecdotally, shared orally, and they don't have the proper techniques of telling those stories. And what comes to mind when stories come to us is that those stories are actually potential evidence to a building of any case against any facility, for example. So what we do instead is to train communities so that they'd be able to technically uh, tell their stories, document what's happening out there, so that they would be able to put all the details that a doctor would appreciate and say, "Oh, the what's happening to you has health impacts," or stories that would have enough details so that a lawyer like Matthew would appreciate it and say, "This is a legal case waiting to happen." Or a story where Yogi, for example, who's a practicing a media practitioner, would say, "This is a story, this is a scoop that's worth telling to everyone." So we connect the stories that people want to tell to the technical minds who would appreciate those stories. And the proper way of really doing that is to cultivate the ability of the people who has stories to tell their stories properly. And I really think what Dr. Ines mentioned earlier, and what Matthew was also saying, was a proposal for us to really think how we can merge both techniques and make that more usable for the frontline communities that are right now across Asia and actually across the world, are waiting for their end of the story to be told. So thank you very much. I'll end there for now.
Thank you so much, Pang. That's really good insight into how both the the different aspects that both Matthew and Dr. Ines brought together can be actually turned into a good form of communication. But now I'd like to turn over to Yogi, who's on the media side of things, who is the sort of person that's going to go out and get these sort of stories and tell these stories and help this information get across. Yogi, what are your insights or your reactions to what you've heard? I think you're still on mute. I can't hear you. I think you're still on.
Okay,
Yeah,
you can hear me now?
Now I can. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Before I continue, I want to thank you to this opportunity. Yes, in Indonesia, we still struggling with this air pollution issues after many years. So as a journalist, I'm based in Jakarta, capital, and that's why most of my coverage is focused in the city. And maybe Matthew mentioned that we recently win about the lawsuit, but still continue the law process because the president and the ministry still deny that Indonesia, especially Jakarta, have a problem about air pollution. So, whilst Jakarta is the busiest city in Indonesia, its trajectory is shared by many other cities in the country. So, whatever direction Jakarta takes in air pollution, it will likely inspire other cities facing similar problem as well. Because the air pollution, it's not only faced by Jakarta, of course. There is a lot of big city in Indonesia like Surabaya, Bandung. They are industry city. They're facing a same situation, but we still waiting about Jakarta. How about the reaction? In Jakarta now, it has about 11 to 13 million people every day inside the city. 3 until 4 million are commuters, like me. I'm also commuters. I live in city near Jakarta, Depok, about 20 or 30 kilometers. So we every day mobility and activity uh, in and out to Jakarta and from Jakarta. Indonesia Bureau of Statistics recorded at least 20.2 million vehicles were driven in the city every day in 2020. Most of them are privately owned vehicles. They raise a huge amount of air pollution risk. Imagine, in each this vehicle, there is only one passenger driving from home to workplace and vice versa. This is horrible. So the challenge is me especially, or me example, as a journalist, is how we deliver the message about air pollution. Uh, I maybe around, I'm making a coverage of air pollution, especially in Jakarta, since 2016 maybe, and almost every year I made coverage about air pollution. But the response from the government, I think it's still stagnant. There is no major movement from the government, especially from the ministry, president. Uh, Maybe we heard before from Honorable Dia about awareness level. Yes, the awareness level is not in line with impact level. Maybe the high education people, the good economy people have a good awareness about air pollution, but the low education people, the low economic people, the poor people have a big impact about air pollution. They don't have a choice. They cannot choose a good space. They cannot choose a good air. They just living in that way. So this is need to be changed. And in my coverage, I use air quality index provided by certain apps, maybe web-based air monitors, and also measure air quality with certain kits. So I'm using a coverage. I made my coverage by carrying a kit to monitoring air pollution on my motorbikes, with city buses, and even in a cafe. So sometimes also setting in, I setting one kit air quality meters to traffic policemen, and even I just leave one a kit to elementary school classroom. So the basic is no one is spared from the threat of air pollution in Jakarta. So this is horrible, of course, but uh, if we talk about the government, does my coverage that I have made left any impact on governmental policy? Yes, it does. But certainly, it's not big enough. And does the coverage finally trigger and improve Jakarta air quality? Unfortunately, not yet. Several policies have been put in place. For example, the vehicle restriction for those emitting above legally allowed level. Recently, a policy on emission quality standard is being used to regulate vehicle allowed to commute in Jakarta and its surrounding buffer zone city, but it's still far from enough, especially since several existing regulations contradict each other. One such circumstance arises between the city and central government. For example, maybe in the Jakarta only, the limitation, they give a limit for vehicle. Not all vehicle can across the Jakarta street, but the central government, they gave a tax relief for a new vehicles. This is funny, I think. So what we need is a commitment. Matthew said, we need a time, we need commitment, and we need money. I think time we don't need. I think time we don't have it. We need it to do it now. The commitment, Jakarta, not yet. And the money, I don't know if we have a lot of money to do that, because this is a huge problem. So we are talking about serious extreme measures to tackle Jakarta's air pollution. This is not only Jakarta. It is now one of the biggest cause of death in the world. Matthew said that, and threat to the children's physical and cognitive growth, of course. So the time is now or never. We need to do it now. Not only Jakarta, and also another city in Indonesia. Thank you, Thai.
Thank you, Yogi, and thank you everyone for your contributions and your insights into this today. I mean, I think there's some key messages that we can take away from this, and one is that, you know, when we're looking at talking with, like Yogi just said, when we're looking at many of these communities, especially the ones that are most impacted, the poor, the less educated communities, there is doing what Pang was talking about, is to helping them understand that they actually have power, that they can actually speak to the governments and create the political capital and the political consequences that Matthew was talking about, in order to make sure the politicians are hearing these voices and to drive change, and through telling stories. And as Dr. Ines says, it's about developing a communication with these communities. It's not just about having directed, disseminated facts and figures talking to them. It's having a communication with them through people that they trust, in order so that they can understand, first of all, the impacts that this is having on their lives, and then to understand that they actually do have the political capital to be able to take the message to politicians to demand the change that's needed, the urgent change that's needed. I mean, we do have approximately 7 million premature deaths a year from air pollution. It's an urgent crisis. It's the largest environmental health crisis on Earth right now. And the other thing that it does too is, because a lot of greenhouse gases are also co-emitted with air pollutants, it's also helping drive climate change. So it's both an immediate and a long-term threat to humanity. So yes, I think that the communication to help politicians understand that there is political capital, not just political risk, but political benefit of acting, and to have people understand that that they do have a voice that is quite powerful on this issue as well, I think has been the lesson from this segment. So I'd like to really thank all of the panelists for your contributions, and very, very much appreciated. And I'm going to now turn it back to Patrick to round up this session. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, thank you, Ty, and thank you for that great summary of the discussion, and thanks to the entire panel for a really fascinating discussion today. You know, it's very apparent that there are large challenges in turning something that seems quite global and abstract at times, and making it more personal and relatable, and making communities understand the health impacts, the personal health impacts, but also some really positive solutions there in terms of giving communities the tools that they need and the power that they need to tell their own stories, and seeing how that can be used in evidence to actually to instigate change. So although there's lots of sobering data and lots of sobering facts that have come about out of this discussion and the other discussions that we've had over this event, it's clear that there are also some really great opportunities and some really positive storytelling opportunities in order to instigate change and learn from the experiences of some communities and some cities, for example, in the case of Jakarta. So I'd like to thank you, everyone who spoke today as well, once again, for a really fascinating and enlightening conversation. I just wanted to, sorry, I'm just going to share my screen very briefly. Just as a quick practical consideration, if people were interested in more information, particularly around developing communications plans for air quality communications, then there was the guidance framework that was developed through the Integrated Programme for Better Air Quality in Asia, which is a program that was implemented by Clean Air Asia the Institute for Global Environmental Studies and Asia Centre for Air Pollution Research, and was supported by the Ministry of Environment, Japan. And I'd like to point you particularly to part 4, which concerns developing effective communication strategies for air pollution issues. And that's available in the resource section of the Clean Air Asia website, which you can find at cleanairasia.org. And there is an interactive version there, as well as downloadable materials. And I think they're really great resources. So if anyone's interested in more information on developing communication strategies for air pollution and for climate change, then I'd absolutely point them in that direction. I think you'll find them very helpful. And just before I close out this session, I'd like to just quickly provide an overview of what's in store for the last day, tomorrow, of this virtual regional learning event. So at 1 p.m, this is GMT plus 8 time. I'm at GMT time, so it's still very early for me at the moment. But we have a session on empowering cities to implement integrated solutions, experiences, and intersectional strategies. And that's followed by a session at 3:10, which is tools and data sandbox, experimenting with data-driven decision making. And then the final session at 4:20 p.m. Is the mobilizing innovative finance for integrated solutions, opportunities in a post-pandemic world. And I think they'll all prove to be really fascinating discussions and sessions. So we really hope to see you there tomorrow. Once again, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today and for taking part, and especially to my colleagues, Glinda and Ty, for their excellent moderating of the discussions today in this session. So thanks once again, and I'd like you all to enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.